Thanks for a nice introduction. Took first 5 parts of my presentation away. That's good. My name is Pal Solberg. I'm living in Norway at the moment. So Marius touched a little bit upon my background. I've been involved in youth work or youth NGOs most of my life. I did spend 6 years as the Secretary General of the Norwegian Association of Youth Centers, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. I've also been the president of POIVE, which is the Professional Open Youth Work in Europe, which is kind of the international association of youth workers in Europe. And today I'm working at the University of Southeast Norway, where I teach in youth knowledge, in participation, youth management, and non-formal education. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of educations we have here and how we are working to prepare youth workers, but also what we need to still develop at the end, I hope. So I was asked to talk a little bit about 3 different subjects, and I have the time until 11, so I'll just stay online and you can catch up with me. So a little bit about the youth work situation in Norway today, and then a little bit about the Youth Center Association or the associations and why they could be important or are important, since you're also talking about the advocacy later today. For me, it's also very linked to competence development and issues like that. And then a little bit about maybe how we prepare youth workers or how we deal with education of youth workers. So that's kind of the 3 subjects I'll try to cover this morning. So I have a couple of slides, so I'll share with you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in PowerPoint. I'll try to speak a little bit more freely. But just to give you some background about where are we in Norway today, and how did we get here? So the situation in Norway today is we have, I'll see if I can share the screen there. I just want to make the screen a little bit bigger so I can see you also. So our history in Norway with municipal run youth centers started in 1953. It's a youth center called Hammersborg in Oslo. It's about the same time as we see youth centers popping up in the US and UK and other places around the world, maybe a little bit earlier there. That being said, we did have kind of youth work before 1953. It was mainly based around NGO delivering or NGO work with young people, youth associations. But when I talk about kind of open youth work, I talk about some kind of service provided to young people, and not necessarily just kind of being involved in a youth association. So our first youth center, which was municipal youth center, was opened in Oslo, our capital, in 1953. It was a reaction to some kind of trends in the time, and also as kind of civil unrest amongst young people. So it was kind of the introduction of rock and roll, early 50s. Rock Around the Clock was a movie shown in this cinema in Oslo, and there was riots outside. People were flipping cars around. So it was really a generational gap where the young people and their parents didn't really understand each other, and they didn't really understand each other's values. So there was a shift, a generational gap between the youth and parents, and these kind of generational gaps throughout our history of youth work has influenced youth work. So from 1953, it was started as a kind of social pedagogic, social work thing in the city center. We had a lot of good people working there, but it was mainly to kind of gather or keep the young people off the streets, were kind of the motivation at that time. During the 50s and 60s, we had growing number of youth centers in Norway. And during the 70s, it really kind of exploded, and we got quite a lot of youth centers, growing steadily throughout the 50s and 60s. But it was the next kind of generational gap, which would maybe be the 68 generation, the flower power movement. Also, the next time we can see that kind of parents and the young generation had some communication issues, or values were different, or young people were more liberal, or coincides with young people moving from the rural areas to the cities, and somehow developing a different set of values. People started working not in industry or farming, but in more service-oriented professions. So we got this kind of value gap once again. And of course, drugs were a huge topic at the time, and the focus of the youth centers shifted from providing a space for young people to more preventive work. So the role of youth centers in the late 60s, early 70s, maybe into the 80s also, were very focused around prevention work in the big cities. Then we had a steady increase of youth centers in Norway in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. I think we had around, it's very hard, we don't have exact numbers, but maybe around 1,000 youth centers in Norway. After that, it's been going a little bit up and down, but today we have registered around 640 youth centers, municipal run youth centers in Norway. In addition, we have, I would guess, somewhere between 100 and 150 NGO run youth centers around the country. Of these, the National Association of Youth Centers we have, or I don't work there anymore, but they have about 600, 620, varies from year to year, youth centers as members. So in Norway, the Youth Center Association, it's got the youth center itself are the members of the association. Around 120,000 young people are using youth centers, around 30% of the youth population. And they have around somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 employees in total. So in Norway, we are 5.3 million people living at the moment. So it's not a big country, and it's also very spread. It's a large country compared to the size of the population. So we have got a lot of rural areas and not that many big cities. But around 30% of young people are using the youth centers on a regular basis. So regular basis meaning once or twice a month, at least. One thing I'd like to clarify a little bit when it comes to, when I talk about youth, and how do I define and understand what youth is. So I understand youth from three perspectives. So on one side, I talk about youth from a biological perspective, meaning the transition from being a child to being adult from a biological standpoint, which starts early teens with puberty and ends maybe sometime in the 20s, early 20s something. So the first part is kind of your body developing, and then the second part will be your brain creating new synapses between the limbal system and the frontal lobe, really controlling kind of what you might call like the impulse center or the limb or the lizard brain and the administrator. So that kind of transition it affects how we as youth workers will work with young people. Young people have some psychological perspective which are different from ours. And I don't know if you touched into this, but it's linked to less impulse control, for instance. So that is a little bit effective when it comes to youth work. The other perspective I sometimes talk about when it comes to what is youth is this cultural understanding of youth, which is, maybe you could say, it's the transition from being totally dependent on somebody, your parents or caregivers, to being totally independent, which means maybe that you have your own housing, you have your own job, you support your own living. And that kind of definition of youth, that's changing all the time. So I sometimes give an example. When my grandfather was 15, I'm from the west coast of Norway, along where fishing was kind of the main industry earlier on. And when my grandfather was 15 years old, he was given a hat and he was sent to sea. That was his transition, a cultural transition from being a child to being an adult. Today, of course, we are studying longer. It's harder to get into the housing market. People are living at home longer in some countries. So this cultural understanding of young people, saying that from being totally dependent on your parents to being totally independent, that varies from country to country, and it varies from time and space all the time. So in some countries, you might say that you're a youngster until you're 30 something. In other countries, in Norway, I think most young people leave their parents' home at 20, something like that. But they're not really supporting themselves with work. They're studying at the university until 25, 26. So that definition of young people, that has increased, at least in Norway, from maybe only 15, 18 to at least maybe 30 today. So the cultural definition of young people is also, and then we have this kind of political decided policy perspective of what young people are. So which is just randomly put numbers. I'm guessing the European Union, it's 14 to 30, in some programs probably 26. In Norway, we have some youth programs going from 12 to 21. We have some going to 24. But we've been talking about municipal youth centers. Most of them, not all, would define young people as 13 to 18. So until you reach the voting age. So it's compared to other definitions of young people, when we talk about youth centers in Norway, we're talking about young people, not early adults or students. We have some youth centers that are also catering to the needs of youngsters 16 to 24. And I would make the case that makes a lot of sense to separate a little bit within this. There are quite a lot of differences between a 13-year-old girl and a 24-year-old student, male. Like, you are in a different place. So services, it's hard to design a service that caters for a 13-year-old and a 29-year-old and meets the same needs. So, but at least when we talk about youth centers in Norway, we're talking about 13 to 18. Most of the time. Most people using the youth centers are 14 to 16. There's a shift. The older you are, the less people are using the youth centers. I'll touch a little bit on that. I'll talk a little bit about the young people that are actually using the youth centers after. To understand a little bit more about what role does the youth center have in Norway, in the kind of the Norwegian in the Norwegian context. So to try to place it a little bit, I think this would be an overview. So most young people up to 18 are attending school, 97, 98%. So that's kind of the biggest arena for young people. It's also important when we talk about youth centers and youth work to understand that we are a part of young people's lives, but there's also more important parts. So school is where young people spend most of their time in Norway. The next would be sports organizations and NGO organizations. I'm saying that a little bit hesitating a little bit when I'm saying it. If we look at young people in Norway at the age of 13, around 63 maybe percent of young people are part of a sports team. They're playing football, soccer, they're skiing, but this kind of organized sports activities, it really decreases very quickly from 13 to 18. So when we reach the age of 18, we're down to maybe 12-15%. So even though sports are a large activity for the youngest young people, it's not a large activity for the older young people. So 60% attend sports, around 20% attend different types of NGOs, political, religious, scouts. So that's the part where the civil society is kind of involved with young people. And then you have the open youth work, which is youth centers. Around 30% of all young people attend the youth centers. And it's the second biggest leisure activity for young people in Norway. So we have sports, youth centers, and then NGOs. I also want to just mention the detached and outreach work. It's a little bit kind of more specialized work. The detached youth workers, they're kind of taking their youth work out on the streets, so they're not connected necessarily to a youth center. So it's reaching maybe 12% of young people, where we take our youth work out to where young people are. Very often their target is a little bit more preventive work, social work. So they're trying to deal with, a lot of the time they're dealing with young people that have some kind of issue or need some kind of support. So the detached and outreach work, we see that in the larger cities. And with larger cities in Norway, I mean, like the local city where I live, Tønsberg, it has 35,000 inhabitants. That would be a medium-large city in Norway. So I'm guessing that cities with 25,000 plus, most of them would have detached youth workers alongside the open youth centers as part of them. And very often they are organized in the same unit, and very often the youth workers we have a lot of detached youth workers who are also working on youth centers, and the other way around, youth center workers also working as detached youth workers. And then we kind of have the social services, which is when families need much heavier support, or even when kids need to be taken out of their family. So that's kind of more, it's more legal things. So the open youth work and the detached youth work, we're dealing in the field of non-formal and informal learning. So that's just a picture. Social services in Norway, maybe around 2 or 3% of young people are involved with the social services, either through giving families support to dealing with everyday life, or having to take children out of their families for a shorter or longer period of time. So school, sports, youth centers, that's the main activity for young people in Norway. Looking a little bit around kind of maybe the philosophy or around the discussion going around youth centers and youth work in Norway, we have always had this kind of conflict in how we deal with and talk about young people or talk about youth work. So on the one side, very early on in Hammersborg in 1953, there was now a very famous professor in Norway, Frønes, who kind of made the statement saying that a youth center is a place to be and a place to learn. which in Norwegian sounds very good. It's very rhythmical and lyrical. But what he's saying is that it's both going to be a place where young people being allowed to just be themselves, just hang around, to create a safe environment for young people to socialize and develop as young people in. And it's also going to be an arena for learning. Today, I understand that as the difference between informal and formal learning arenas. So you have the formal learning arenas, which are schools, universities, and then you have the non-formal learning arenas, which are facilitated learning, supported learning. There's a difference in those two. The main difference, the way I understand it, is that the formal learning arenas like school, your learning goals are set by others most of the time, by government or teachers. So you as a student, maybe I'm interested as a good teacher in how you're going to learn these things, but I know that you're going to learn math and you're going to learn a specific part of math this year. While with non-formal learning, the learning needs comes from me. I'm the one who defines my learning needs. And then the informal learning arena, it's this place to be. It's just this learning that happens between people in an informal way. So I sometimes give an example of myself, because I've been attending youth centers since I was 10. We have some junior youth centers also, so you can start a little bit earlier. And I was active and in the youth center board as a youth when I was 14, 15, very active. So I saw a friend of mine, he was playing the guitar. He was sitting on the couch and he was very, very popular with the ladies, the young girls. And I figured out I need to learn how to play the guitar because I had such a musical interest. So I sat down with him and he taught me kind of the first couple of things you need to learn to play guitar. And I kind of enjoyed it. I had fun playing. And then a youth worker noticed that I was kind of dealing with that, and he was learning me a little bit. And a couple of weeks later, he came to me and said, Paul, you know, one of our youth workers, he's also a guitar player, and he has this kind of guitar course every Thursday. That if you want to attend, you can go. So he kind of started a facilitated learning process for me by giving me access to learning in a way based on my needs and my motivation. And then later on, I started music school, which I took the travel from informal to non-formal to formal education. And this creating the arena for both young people being allowed to learn from each other, which is an important learning arena, and also to learn in a facilitated way with support of youth workers, is one of the main roles of youth work, I think, in Norway. On the other side, we have this debate all the time. Are we doing youth work and providing these services to allow young people to be young, or to support young people becoming adults? So are we dealing with preparing them for life, or are we helping them being in the situation they are? Another way of framing it, and which we discuss a lot in Norway, because youth work in Norway, it has two legs. On one side, it's a cultural service. So we provide a lot of music rooms, dance rooms. So this is the place where young people can perform their own culture. We do have like formal culture schools or that you can go to, but they are usually training young people in classical music, reading sheet music, ballet. So the cultural expression of young people themselves has always been happening within the youth centers. So the development of hip hop, graffiti, skate culture, rock culture, metal culture, street dance. Today, a lot of youth centers are providing dance lessons or or at least a dance room where young people can dance. And also when after music production and video production equipment has become so accessible and everything is computerized, a lot of youth centers are also having like editing rooms or recording rooms or studio production rooms. So it's always been a very important arena for young people to express their own culture on their own premises, in an often supported by, in this non-formal way, supported by youth workers. But really, that has been a backbone of Norwegian youth work, is that we are providing a cultural service to young people. On the other side, the motivation of politicians very often are, we want to support youth centers because we want to keep young people from whatever worry they have at the moment, fighting, drinking, taking drugs. So it's prevention work. And so the motivation of politicians to support youth centers are usually done from this preventive social control perspective, while the youth workers very often have this social development or cultural approach. So this has been a debate for many years, and you can ask youth centers in Norway, are you doing social work or are you doing cultural work? And you will get different answers. So I tried in this kind of overview to plot in a little bit. Let me see if I can. Some of these things here, crosses they're called. So that would be, how would you define yourself as a youth center? So most youth centers, they will say, we're somewhere in the middle. We are providing informal space for young people to hang out, to just learn from each other, to be able to meet each other under safe circumstances. There are youth workers there, they feel safe there. And we are also providing some kind of learning opportunities. Then we have youth centers which would say that, no, we are not open for everybody. We are, you can't be here if you're not part of one of our projects. So very few, but they exist. And we also have youth centers where they say, no, we are not really providing any learning opportunities here. It's just a place for young people to hang out. So you have everything, but most of them would gather in the middle, saying that we are offering both space for young people to hang out and a space for them to learn. And when it comes to this social control or social development or cultural versus preventive work, I think also most youth centers in Norway would gather in the middle, saying that, yeah, we are offering services to young people, cultural services, but we also have a preventive kind of function. But we have places, there's one youth center in Oslo, for instance, which was opened in the middle of this very drug trafficking heavy area, which would say that we are here to do social work alone. We are not offering any other services. We're only supporting young people in getting in or out of a habit, or providing opportunities for these young people with very difficult circumstances to move somewhere else. So you can see we have places which will say that we're only doing culture work and you can only be here on a project-based term, like a very nice youth center in northern Norway called Tvibit. They would say, if you go here, you have to be part of one of our projects and we are only doing culture work. The effect of it could still be preventive work, but they would never say that they're doing preventive work. So for me, this is an understanding of this. You can be both. No young people would ever go to a youth center to be prevented from doing something. Young people are going to youth centers because they have an interest of what's happening there. Either because there are peers there, they have other young people that they could meet, talk to, meet a boyfriend, girlfriend, something like that. It's a huge motivation. Or you have interesting activities. Now, even though the effect of a youth center could be very much beneficial from a preventive perspective, preventing young people of taking drugs or other aspects of prevention, basically everything. You know, of course, a couple of years ago, we coin youth work as the solution to every problem, like if it's extremism or drugs or youth pregnancy or and yes, it can be, because youth centers do have, and we have studies showing, like a generally a good effect, preventive effect on social behavior, because you are in a safe environment, you feel supported, and other things that are good from you not getting into problems. So you can say that youth centers are good preventive measures in itself, and almost for anything, because it's creating a connection. You have somebody you can trust. If you come from a family with violence at home or very unstable relations, you can definitely benefit from being at the youth center. But this was just to show you kind of most youth centers will be in the middle. They would provide some space to be and a place to learn, and they would be somewhere in between social control and social development or personal development. And I'm not saying that anything is right or wrong. I'm just saying that that's how I understand Norwegian and maybe Nordic youth policy or youth centers. So let me see. I did some notes, but they're in English. So that's my understanding of the diversity of Norwegian youth centers. They have different approaches. They have different influences. Maybe somebody's leaning in one direction, somebody else is leaning in another. But I don't see this as yes, Marius.
Yeah, you're saying that it's really like different case in each youth center, but are those choices? I had the word, but now I forgot. Conscious choices, or it just happens? And to which extent the political will or municipality understanding is important and affects the youth work situation?
Yeah, so I would say that it's sometimes it's a deliberate choice, like Tvibit or Riverside in Oslo, which this Tvibit is cultural house. They made a very conscious choice saying that we're doing this kind of youth work or having this approach. Many times it's developed from tradition, I think. I think most people would say that they are culture workers and social. I think like being in the middle, that's a conscious choice, because you're thinking about what your role is as a youth center, as a youth worker, or what are my activities. From a political view, very, very often the motivation is, and we also have studies on this, is from preventive work. So, and that's a problem. Also working as with Ungdom and Fritid, the National Association of Youth Centers, we of course got more impact if we pointed out the preventive effects of youth centers, for instance. Then if we say we're going to create a very nice space for young people to be allowed to be themselves. And we try to kind of make arguments about, like, we didn't build an opera in Oslo to prevent 60-year-old women drinking champagne. We did it because we saw self-value in that cultural expression, and we need to see the self-value in youth's own cultural expressions also. And youth are always kind of in the cutting edge very often of driving what's going to be the kind of next wave of cultural expression. So it's hard to argue on both sides. I think it's important to do so. I think it's important not to only lift up the preventive or social pedagogic side of youth work, but also saying that there's another value also, which is equally important, but of course harder to get financing for. So I do have, we made a pamphlet, I remember, called Can We Afford Not To? Where we said, this is the effect of youth centers. This is how much money you will save on, like having, if one youngster become semi-criminal, it's usually cost the society more every year than running one youth center. So we say if we can prevent one youngster from going in a bad direction, so basically we have financed ourselves. But also arguing with prevention work is very hard to measure, because if these young people didn't, especially the effect of youth centers, we have done it, and we can see that, for instance, on alcohol use, we can see an improvement in young people who are attending or not attending a youth center. So we do know that there is a preventive effect, and it's a proven preventive effect. But did I not drink a beer when I was 17 because I went to a youth center, or because I met this drug addict in school when I was 10, or maybe my parents had a lot of impact, or my friends? So it's so hard to isolate kind of the youth center as a preventive. You live the whole life, and you live your life in many arenas. And let's see, I just saw a question: is there a specific on youth centers and their intervention, social, cultural, 60%? How is balanced? We don't have any numbers on that, and I think that if we would ask the youth centers themselves, they might be doing cultural work, but they will define themselves as social workers, because the cultural work is basically just there to attract young people, and the other way around. So even self-reported numbers on this is a little bit hard to assess.
Well, maybe you could tap a little bit into the competencies of youth worker, because when we talk about young people and their needs in that age, so sometimes we think that youth worker has to be able to do everything. Yeah. But if you will boil it down to the kind of basic elements, what that would be?
It would be a Swiss Army knife.
Still.
So basically, we understand youth work as a tool to fix almost all problems. And also we motivate our choices, and especially when we come to advocacy, we're always the solution to all the problems. And I think we are part of the solution to a lot of different problems. And the Swiss Army knife is really good at getting you out of a sticky situation when you're in it. But it's not the highly specialized tool. It's not a tool. So I could maybe fix a splinter in my finger with the Swiss Army knife, but I wouldn't do brain surgery with it. So for me, the youth worker's role is, especially when it comes to the social work perspective, it's to be the first response. It's to be the front line, the first meeting with young people. And this is a different subject and could take me hours to talk about, but if you meet a young person who's been abused sexually or violently, or a young person who's talking about suicide, or you see signs of radicalization. So your job as a youth worker, for me, it's not to fix that problem. It's to know how to respond to it initially, and also know what kind of services around you. So I see youth work as a very cross-sectorial work. You need to know the services surrounding you. So I need to know how to respond to a young person who approaches me with a problem, but I can't treat it. I can't fix it. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a professional healthcare worker. I'm not the social services. So I would need to know how to react here and there, and how to deal with this situation. And then I need to find a way to get additional support from professional or people with more specialized knowledge than me. So I think youth workers can be kind of this multi-tool, but it's not a very good tool for very specialized tasks. So we can work with a large number of young people, but if you're dealing with somebody with a mental health issue, you can be supportive and you can know where to get help, or them to get help. But your role is not to enter as a role of a psychologist. Your role is to support young people in that initial period, knowing how to communicate with young people in difficult situations. But your role is not to fix every problem. But so the Swiss Army knife for me is a good analogy of a youth worker. It's not a very specialized tool, but it can fix a lot of small problems. And at least it can fix a problem if you have a car breaking down, you can probably fix something until you can get to the workshop to get it fixed. But your role is to kind of help young people going from A to B. So taking that transition from helping right here and now, and then kind of getting the support that young people need.
Mm-hmm. So do you need to have a university degree or some special training to be youth worker and to be allowed to work in the youth center in Norway?
No. So there are no regulations for competences for youth workers in Norway, and we do have a lot of different people working in youth centers. And even though I teach at the university in youth work, and we're also now hoping to start the first bachelor's degree in open youth work in Norway during the next couple of years, I would not say that it's necessary to work with young people. I do think that you need somebody with a skill set, a complex skill set, which is a little bit psychology, a little bit social pedagogics, a little bit leisure time activities, maybe event planning. But not everybody. What would be normal in Norwegian Youth Center? I think we would have 1 or 2 trained youth workers, maybe from social work or social pedagogics or from the university courses that I teach in, that are managing the youth center. And then we will have a lot of usually quite young people with skills that are important to have when you come work with young people. So a lot of them are young music producers or musicians or dance instructors, and then they don't need to be like specially trained and have a bachelor's degree to do a good job. But they do need, I think, to have somebody to talk to if it gets very complicated. So you need somebody that's a little bit trained in the environment when shit hits the fan, to say it like that, and it will. So I think you can volunteer, youth worker. So competences is complicated. It's both knowledge, it's your personal skills, it's your attitude towards something. And I think you can be a professional youth worker also without education and being paid, as long as you kind of follow a code of ethics. You work in a deliberate way. You think about how you work. POIVE has some really good kind of guidelines for what does it mean to be a youth worker. Where are your loyalties? Kind of what are your role as a professional, so a professional adult in a young person's life. These things you need to be aware of to be a good youth worker, but it doesn't necessarily require a university degree.
Thank you, Paul. We will have to let you go, but now I just came up with one question which we didn't agree to discuss before. But when you first came to Lithuania 17 years ago, nobody was speaking English and we had no clue about youth work. And now last week we were showing quite many videos from different youth centers in Lithuania. And I mean, all around Lithuania, we have well-working youth centers, and some participants think that we're living in a great country. So what happened in your perspective? What helped to spread the youth work in Lithuania?
So I think there are different elements to that. I think one of them would be the first association I worked with in Lithuania was the Association of Youth Coordinators. And to have this kind of umbrella organization that could push a little bit politically to establish more youth centers, but also we had the same issue in Norway, even though we've done youth work for a long time. It's about developing a language. And I think education is one way to do that. Associations is another. We need to make sure that we speak about the same thing. Like when I talked a little bit earlier about what is a young person, it could be understood in different ways. And I need to clarify that when I talk about young people in this perspective, I'm talking about 13 to 18. It's because I worked in Europe for many years and I didn't really understand that. It took me a couple of years before I understood that young people in other kind of definitions are bigger, larger. We're working with students, or in some countries in Europe, if you're a single farmer living with your mother, you can be a young person by definition until you're 49. So to develop a language together, to make sure that when I talk about preventive work, cultural work, informal, non-formal learning, having these kind of terminology makes us able to discuss between borders. And in Norway also, we needed to kind of develop this language to make sure that when I talk about young people or youth work, I understand if you're from the north of Norway to the south of Norway. I need to be able to talk about the things we're talking about and understand each other. And that took some time. And I think in Lithuania, that was one part of the solution. I think a lot of youth workers in Lithuania share a language and understanding of what they're doing, which makes it possible also to further develop as professionals. And professionality for me is also about language, being able to communicate in a good way. So understanding terminology, having this basic education training, it's for me super important in both developing yourself as a youth worker, but also developing the field of youth work. And in Lithuania also, I think political will. At some point, politicians really wanted to do something. So it was both bottom up and top down. So there was a demand and there was also political support.
And also there were some funding opportunities, which was increasing political will.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think
funding is important.
Today we will discuss a bit more, and I also dropped a few things in a chat because sometimes you can use good examples, sometimes you can really pressure the need, sometimes you can relate to European documents of frameworks of funding opportunities, and Nerijus will also help to get to those topics soon. So I think let's share some reactions to what Paul was saying before we let him go to join another meeting in a couple of minutes. So I give the heart, because it also proves a bit what we were speaking this week and last week. And I think there is quite good tendencies on European level, and we can really use it to leverage a bit the developments in our local realities. Okay, thank you, Paul, a lot. And I will also join your other meeting very soon. Thanks, and have a good day.
And if you have any pressing questions, I can join you after the next meeting if somebody really wants to discuss something.
And also, I recorded this meeting separately. I will upload it to our Facebook event, and I will tag Paul. So if you have questions or comments, we can also continue virtual discussion there. Okay.
Very good. Nice to see you all. I have to leave for another meeting.
Thank
you.
I hope you
enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.